I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Flora Gladwin.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
Welcome to Climate Optimists. As a group of concerned citizens, we're on a journey to explore climate solutions and ways each of us can make a difference. Well, it's our first episode back after a nice long summer break. And, with the time off and thinking about the fact that we're approaching our 100th episode, decided to take a different approach. Rather than moving to kind of a seasons approach like we talked about prior to the break. Instead, we're going to be really releasing an episode when we feel like there's, a major update or kind of development in the climate space rather than being tied to a fixed interval. And so knowing that things are going to be a little more ad hoc and less frequent, we want to stay in touch. So if you haven't already, make sure you head over to our website and sign up for our newsletter. You can also follow us on social, and that way you'll be the first to know when new content is coming out. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to Flora to introduce today's topic.
Over the past few months, we've been thinking about the upcoming U.S. election and its potential implications for the climate. While there have been numerous opinion pieces by news outlets, most we've encountered lack depth or fail to paint a complete picture. Given this, we decided it was time to explore the topic ourselves, including what are the stakes of this election? Where do the candidates stand on climate change? And how can each of us get involved to ensure pro-climate majority at a state and national level? But before we go there, let's take a look at this week's Reason for Hope.
Thanks, Flora. There are new EPA methane and mercury emissions rules about to come into force. Despite legal protests from fossil fuel producing states and industry groups, this week the Supreme Court rejected their appeals. And this is a big deal considering some of the recent anti-climate rulings. Methane accounts for about 10% of the US emissions, and the fossil fuel industry is the single largest source of methane. So this law is projected to cut those emissions by approximately 80%.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty exciting development, especially, as you said, given the recent rulings that have kind of undermined the Environmental Protection Agency's authority to regulate climate and related environmental issues. So yeah, I think it's a big deal. We'll, who's to say what's down the road, but these methane emissions are easy enough to regulate with today's technology. And so, yeah, it's pretty ridiculous to see these states and fossil fuel industry pushing back, but not really a surprise. So with that, our guest today to come and talk to us about this upcoming election and its implications for the climate is Tiernan Sittenfeld, the Senior Vice President for Government Affairs at the League of Conservation Voters here in the U.S., or LCV. She directs LCV's policy and lobbying efforts with Congress and the executive branch on a range of issues, including climate change, energy, public lands, water, and chemical policy reform. She also works on LCV's legislative accountability campaigns and oversees the National Environmental Scorecard. Tiernan is a graduate of Dartmouth College and lives in Washington, D.C. with her husband and two sons. Tiernan, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Thank you, Jason. Great to be with you.
Well, let's start off with a basic question. When it comes to efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful? And I know that can be challenging sometimes, but interested in your answer.
It certainly can be challenging because obviously the climate crisis is very real and it's having deadly and devastating impacts today. It's not a distant threat. It is our reality today. But having said all of that, there's so much to be optimistic about. For starters, the Inflation Reduction Act, which we also refer to as the Biden-Harris administration's Affordable Clean Energy Plan, is the largest investment that the world has ever seen in climate solutions and clean energy and in environmental justice. It's $370 billion in investments, and it is already supercharging our clean energy economy, and that we're just getting started. So the solutions to the climate crisis are win-win-win. They are good for our economy, they're good for creating good paying, family sustaining jobs, and they're helping the planet. So that is the biggest thing that is making me optimistic.
And that's a great point that, a lot of these are not necessarily just sort of standalone helping us avoid a worsening climate, but there are these co-benefits too, which I think can get lost sometimes as we talk about these things. Well, and can you talk a little bit for those who might not be familiar? What does the League of Conservation Voters do as an organization?
Well, thank you for asking. The League of Conservation Voters works to elect environmental champions up and down the ballot. We do that in partnership with our 32 state LCV partners around the country. But we don't just work on elections for election's sake. We work on them as a strategy to then be able to make more policy progress. We also work to make progress through executive action. So we've been really delighted to work with the Biden-Harris administration on things like making cars and trucks more efficient, power plants cleaner, addressing methane pollution, protecting public lands as national monuments. And we also very much believe that a healthy climate and a healthy democracy go hand in hand. So we do a lot of work on voter registration, voter rights, making sure that all people in this country are able to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, to enjoy equitable access to public lands, to participate in our democracy without fear. And so we've got a lot on our plate, and we're really excited about it and all in to make more progress.
Well, all worthy stuff, definitely not a small agenda. And I suspect when we get to the back end, definitely some opportunities for our folks who are, wanting to get more engaged to do so.
Absolutely. Yes, bring it on.
Great. Well, let's kind of talk about, and we were before we started recording, I know I mentioned this. I think politicians can always be kind of hyperbolic about the election cycles and how this one is the election of a lifetime or a generation. But wondering if you can speak to, when it comes to climate action, what's really at stake with this election, maybe starting kind of with a national level.
I actually don't think it's hyperbole to say that literally everything is on the line when it comes to our climate. We have finally started to make progress on the climate crisis at the scale that science and environmental and racial justice require, both through the Inflation Reduction Act and through the executive action, combined with the progress in the states and in the marketplace. But we are now 47 days from an election where we have the most anti-environmental president ever in Trump, who literally worked to overturn more than 100 common sense environmental protections, who pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement, who tried to build the Keystone XL tar sands pipeline. I mean, truly, there aren't words for how anti-environmental and pro-polluter he was. And on the campaign trail, he's made clear that a second term would make the first one look like child's play. And the contrast with that could not be more stark than with the leadership of Vice President Harris, who has been a leader going back to her days in California, where she cracked down on big oil and polluters as Attorney General. When she was in the Senate representing the state of California, she pushed for more progress, especially when it comes to electric school buses, to lead pipes. And then she was very instrumental in fighting for and casting the deciding vote on the Inflation Reduction Act as vice president. So she is absolutely committed and is going to build on the leadership that we have seen her be a critical part of as vice president during the Biden-Harris administration.
Well, and wondering is sort of if we fast forward and think about, let's say, a Harris-Walz administration. What kinds of things do we need to pass or to happen at a policy level to kind of, obviously we made great progress with the Inflation Reduction Act, but we're not there yet. If we were to sort of fast forward, are there, big picture things that need to occur to get us to where we need to in terms of emission reductions?
So the Inflation Reduction Act was not like once in a generation legislation. It is first in a generation legislation. It is historic, it's transformational, and we need to build on that. So we are working very hard at the League of Conservation Voters to make sure that we have a pro-climate trifecta come January 2025 so that we can start legislating again to make more progress. So we need to have IRA, or Inflation Reduction Act, Clean Energy Affordability Plan 2.0, to continue to make investments. The Inflation Reduction Act actually was a compromise. It ended up being smaller than we initially hoped. So there's more that needs to be done on like the intersection of energy efficient, climate smart housing and affordable housing. There was a lot more to do in terms of cleaning up the industrial sector. There's some executive actions that the EPA didn't quite finalize, like on cleaning up existing gas power plants. So there's a lot more work to be done, which is why the stakes in this election are so high. We're finally starting to make the progress we need, but as we have experienced with this being the hottest summer on record, with the deadly and devastating fires and floods and storms, this really is catastrophic. It will only get worse if we don't really transition to a 100% clean energy economy once and for all, and that has to happen in this election and in the coming years.
So lots on the line, but potential for making continued progress, closing the gap if we can get the right folks into office. Wondering maybe if we pivot, kind of more broadly, can you talk a little bit about like what are the stakes more internationally? Because I think people, we tend to focus maybe on what's going on in the US, but climate change is a global problem.
Yeah, and I think for a long time, the rest of the world was disappointed by the US's failure to lead, skeptical about what we would do. We had tried and failed to pass a climate change bill back in 2009, 2010. And then we saw President Obama at the time start to really use his executive authority to make major progress on things like cleaning up pollution from power plants. And then that helped us going into the Paris climate agreements and having John Podesta and President Obama really showing the US is serious. To get the world to agree to the Paris Climate Accords was a big, big deal. And then, of course, we needed to build on that progress. And instead, we had Trump, who, and there was even in those early months, we thought maybe he won't be as extreme. Maybe cooler heads will prevail. Maybe he'll realize this is good for our economy. It's good for our national security. We cannot get out of the Paris Climate Agreement. But no, he went with his most extreme, fringy views, and he pulled us out, which was devastating, not just for this country, but for the world and countries across the world who have been counting on the US to lead.
So obviously, those of us who are concerned about climate change want to see a pro-climate administration, in Congress. There are the potential political realities that we could end up with something that is more divided, and and in the worst case, something where we have Trump and then a Congress that isn't pro-climate at all. I'm wondering if you could talk about kind of the different potential outcomes in those scenarios.
I think so many people across this country, myself included, know that we can never wake up the way we did after the elections in 2016 and feel so shocked and so devastated and so ill prepared. So we're, on one hand, doing everything that we possibly can to ensure that we have the best outcome, but we have to be prepared for all of the outcomes. So starting with the worst case, which would be an anti-democracy, anti-climate trifecta, where we would lose the Senate, where we would not flip the House, where we would lose the White House, that is devastating to contemplate. But we would absolutely be fighting back in all of the ways that we possibly can, using all of the levers of power. And at LCV, we feel very fortunate that we work with 32 state LCV partners across the country. And we saw last time around that state leaders, governors, attorney general, people across the country can be so effective, can really stand up to an authoritarian government, which is what, unfortunately, we fear the Trump administration would be looking like. So I don't want to get too into the details, but we are definitely would be prepared for that, but we are fighting tooth and nail to ensure that it doesn't come to that. There's also a scenario in which we are in divided government, which is what we're in now, where we would want to make as much progress as we possibly can in all the ways that are possible. So with the if we had a pro-environment President Harris and Vice President Walz, they could pursue a lot of executive action.
Right.
But then regardless, we will continue to make progress in the states. There's going to be a lot of climate champions who are on the ballot at the state level, and it's critically important that they win so that we make progress, because it's not either or. We need the state progress and the federal progress to complement each other. And during the last Trump administration, our state LCV partners came together with LCV to start something called the Clean Energy for All campaign that was focused on all of these states working together to get more and more communities to be on track to have 100% clean energy by, it was 2050, now we've moved up the deadline quite a bit, or the timeline, now on track to be 2040. But that is really exciting. That is the kind of progress that we're going to keep fighting for under any scenario.
So in essence, it's sort of, the typical plan for the worst, hope for the best. But important for people to understand that it isn't, live or die at the federal level, that there are, our progress on climate has been achieved by what's going on at the federal level and all of this legislative progress at the states as well.
Yes, and governors taking executive action at the state level as well, local action. I mean, the climate crisis is massive, but the opportunities to make progress are equally big and sweeping and, again, really good in all kinds of ways. The benefits are very clear. So that's what we're going to keep focusing on.
I mean, this is maybe a personal interest, but I know there used to be a contingent of sort of more moderate, at least House Republicans that were willing to talk about climate change. I don't know if that still exists.
That is a great question. When I first moved to DC and started doing advocacy for the environment and especially working on public lands issues, there were regularly 30 or 40 House Republicans, this is going back to the early 2000s, who would buck their party leadership and vote pro environment. But then over time, we saw with Citizens United, the really just corrosive, terrible impact of polluter money on politics, and especially in driving the Republicans to be more and more extreme. And we saw more and more of the sort of pro environment Republicans of the early 2000s who either retired or lost their reelections. They were maybe temporarily, those districts represented by Democrats like around 2008. And then many of them, those Democrats lost the rise of the Tea Party in 2010. We saw the Republican Party just move more and more to the right, become more and more beholden to their polluter allies. And so we saw a real plummeting of average scores for Republicans in Congress. And so unfortunately there's maybe one Republican who usually votes pro-environment. That's Brian Fitzpatrick in that Philadelphia area.
So it sounds like there's been this sort of unfortunate erosion in support among Republicans for, pro-environment, pro-climate legislation over the years. Maybe, soon we're reaching kind of the pendulum has swung all the way one way and it starts swinging back. But it also sounds like the good news is there are Republican voters who are demanding these sort of common sense things. So hopefully that acts eventually as sort of a check on these policy perspectives.
Hope springs eternal. And there are increasingly young Republicans who absolutely want a healthy climate and want elected officials to support a healthy climate. And I think, again, we're seeing how extreme Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, is, how extreme Trump is, that they are risking a government shutdown, that they are going after the Inflation Reduction Act, even though it's so popular. And they're actually starting to get more and more pushback from inside their own party.
Well, fingers crossed. So, as we kind of look forward, wondering if, people are listening to this, obviously concerned about the election, let's talk a little bit about opportunities for people to get involved, right? I mean, obviously beyond just doing their duty and voting.
I love that question. There is so much for people to do, both in the final days and weeks before the elections and in the weeks and months after that. So people can make sure that they know how their members of Congress vote on the most pressing environmental issues of the day on the LCV scorecard where we keep track. You can see how your representative and how your senators vote. You can also definitely raise your voice. You can, not by yelling, of course, but by communicating directly to your members of Congress. You can call them and give them a kudos for a good vote or let them know you're disappointed if they take a bad vote. You can write a letter to the editor, to your local newspaper. We would love for people to become LCV members, and then they can volunteer with us through our Green Roots program, where our members are able to knock on doors, to talk to voters about why you're supporting Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and reminding people where to vote, how to vote, when to vote. Phone banking is another great opportunity. There's lots of opportunities to write letters or postcards encouraging people to vote, telling them why you vote. So there's lots of opportunities to get involved, and we can share the link with you to share with your listeners, if that makes sense. We would love to do that.
Perfect. Yeah. And it sounds like there's lots of different flavors. So depending on what somebody's comfortable with or interested in, there's an opportunity to get engaged. So, we've talked a lot about the, election for the White House. Obviously people are from states some of which are critical when it comes to, holding the Senate or taking the House. Um, Wondering if you can mention briefly, maybe some of those races for folks who may not be aware, where their vote, counts for extra, if you will, this cycle.
I would love to mention some specific incumbent champions in the Senate in particular. So, starting on the West Coast, we have John Tester, who is the only organic farmer in the Senate. He is great. He's a real outdoors person, as I said, an organic farmer. He's in a very tight race. Going down to Nevada, Jackie Rosen is another clean energy and public lands and conservation champion who is in a tight race against someone named Sam Brown. We've got to help her make sure that she can win. I should mention, if people would like to make contributions in addition to making phone calls or knocking on doors or sending postcards, go to givegreen.com and you can support all of these candidates and many others. That's a partnership between LCV and the NRDC Action Votes.
Oh, great.
We then continuing across the country, there's another tight race in the state of Wisconsin with Tammy Baldwin, who's the incumbent senator, who is a real champion for climate, for clean energy, for clean water. Then we go down to Ohio. I'm from my home state of Ohio. Sherrod Brown is in a very, very tough race. And we've got to do everything we can to help him win. He's really at the intersection of good paying union jobs and climate solutions. And then moving over, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania is running, again, also in a very tight race and has been a big champion for clean water, for public lands, someone we've got to help make sure comes back to the Senate. So those are a few of the incumbents who we're most focused on. There are also some great senators, great candidates running who we hope will come to the Senate, like Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan or Ruben
Okay.
Gallego in Arizona. I probably have mentioned too many at this point, so I'll stop. But there are more at givegreen.com.
Perfect. Well, we'll include a link to that and folks can check it out and
Great.
get versed on, who they could potentially support. Well, Tiernan, thanks for making the time to come and talk to us and to, give us all these potential opportunities to get involved because I think it's a challenge sometimes. You feel like, climate change is so big, but I think having ways to plug in is key.
Couldn't agree more, Jason, and really appreciate everything that you do and the opportunity to talk about the opportunities actually, because it really is, there's so much that we can each do in our day-to-day lives, and the opportunity for all of us to really engage is very exciting. Keeps me hopeful and positive. So appreciate what you're doing and the opportunity to chat with you.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, what'd you guys think of the interview with Tiernan?
I had a lot of takeaways. I mean, I think the most important thing, the most pressing thing that I was thinking about was just what a massive election this is. And it's on the forefront of American voters' minds that 62% of registered voters want a pro-climate government. And that's according to the Yale program on climate change communications. It's their US survey that surveyed liberals, conservatives, independents all across the board. Along with that stat, they found that 4 out of 10 voters say that a candidate's position on global warming is very important in deciding who they'll vote for in the 2024 election. So I think for me that felt like a moment of optimism, at least, that we've moved past a place of is it or isn't important.
Yeah, Flora, I've read a little bit. I know we've talked about the Yale survey and the great job they do, with George
Mhm.
Mason kind of taking the pulse of Americans. And while I think the three of us would probably all agree that it would be great for climate change to be at the very top of everyone's lists, but the fact that regardless of party, you put all the Democrats, Republicans, and independents together, and you still have 62% saying who they vote for, should be pro climate. I think that's a big deal. And, I think that's sort of makes me think about another reason kind of for optimism, which is that even if we end up, with kind of a split, some of the climate bills that we've talked about on this podcast have bipartisan support. And with the right kind of nurturing and push, could work their way through committees and potentially make their way to the president's desk. One of those is the Forests Act that would really help limit agricultural products and others coming into this country from places that where deforestation is a real issue. And then the second one of those is the carbon border adjustment, which has garnered some bipartisan support as well. And for those who are like, what is a carbon border adjustment? It's basically a kind of a climate tariff where the goods that come into a country are subject to a fee based on the amount of carbon emissions used to produce them. So if you have something like steel coming from a country that's has really aggressive climate goals, there might not be a fee. Where if it's coming from a country that's still very dirty, the fee is going to be high. And as it turns out, there are both Republicans and Democrats who've expressed interest in passing a carbon border adjustment. Thomas, what about thoughts from your end?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that if 62% of people want a pro-environment government, like, where have we gone wrong that 38% of people are not pro-environment, right? Looking at the situation that we currently face globally with record droughts, forest fires, heat waves, that we still have 38% of people that don't think that we need a government that will do anything about it. So that raises a few questions in my mind. But
Fair enough.
listening to a interview of the Polish foreign minister recently, Radek Sikorski, it made me realize that we've got to make sure that these people that are fighting, the will to do anything about the current climate situation, we've got to make sure that we're reaching out to them and showing them why they need to get on the bus. And we're not just ignoring their concerns, because it's a bit like, we've spoken about in previous episodes where, we need social equality and all these things to come together. Well, although these people might not be a minority as such, because typically they're older white voters in, Midwestern or Southern states, we need to realize that they hold significant power in this election because of the Electoral College. So it's about painting a picture of the future to these people about how their lives will actually be better once we transition off this dependence on fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And I think if we don't do that, we'll constantly be hitting our heads against the walls as these people hold such significant political sway in the US electoral system.
I think that's a great point. Tiernan, as I was talking to her,
Mhm.
was talking about some of the co-benefits, right? So, those of us who are really concerned about climate change, myself included, you can be guilty of like, well, this is going to cut emissions by X amount. And so of course we should implement it and regardless of the cost. But I think, when we're talking about, to your point, Thomas, the benefits of, let's say, renewable energy on job creation and reducing point source pollution in communities, like, creating energy independence. Like there are different narratives out there that, are appealing to different groups. And even if that group isn't have climate change as a top priority, you still might be able to get their support for something like, renewable energy incentives if you're framing it in the right way. So I think that's a really important distinction and something all of us in the, pro climate action community, need to remember.
Yeah. I mean, it really is critical that we get people on board, whatever narrative that we have to be convincing, because these next 4 years are just huge for the climate, especially if we look at global climate targets, whether, that's within the US or outside with international treaties. I mean, we have, take, for example, the Paris Agreement, which legally binds countries to keeping global temperature increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre industrial levels, which is a target that obviously we're rapidly approaching. And this is just one of many climate targets that has a really critical 2030 goal, which will be decided in the next 4 years, whether or not we're able to reach that.
For sure.
And even within the US, the Biden administration set a new goal in 2021 for the US to reduce their emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. And we know that these 4 years are really our last critical window to hit that.
Yeah. If we're going to, as a country, reach our targets, that you mentioned, Flora, if we're going to help globally and, moving forward with other major emitters to reach global targets, we have to have folks in government that are pro climate and recognize, the urgency of the issue. Yeah, and the other thing that's coming to mind, I think, I want to call out because when I was talking with Tiernan, sort of jumped in my head is that I know there are a number of environmentally minded folks, folks who care about climate change, that were disappointed, under the Biden administration, that fossil fuel production has actually grown, um, and myself included. I do think it's important we keep in mind, though, the most critical piece is that we're taking measures to limit demand. It's one thing to try to limit supply, but if you still have demand for fossil fuels, there's always going to be somebody who's willing to pump that out of the ground. And so it's really essential that we're able to make, legislative progress, things like the Inflation Reduction Act, because those are the things that are the end game. Those are the things that, eliminate that demand for fossil fuels. And if nobody's calling for fossil fuels, they won't get pumped out of the ground anymore. So just wanted to kind of put that out there and acknowledge that, it hasn't been great to see that the Biden administration has, over the last 4 years helped increase fossil fuel production. It's definitely not the direction we want to see, but I think it's important to keep in mind that the real game changer is that, we're taking measures to limit that demand side.
And I think once you get enough people transitioned over to renewable energy, then there becomes increased voting pressure to bring those rules in place that constrain the extraction of future fossil fuels. But it's really hard when, people have still got a petroleum-based vehicle sitting in their driveway, right? So the sooner we can get everybody over, the sooner we can bring in tougher regulations restricting that extraction.
Yeah, great point, right? We wouldn't have seen these states suing to block these EPA rules if all of those states were big into renewable energy, right?
Exactly.
It's a great point. With that, let's talk about ways we can win an actual pro-climate majority in November. We've got two options today, and option one is to consider a donation to givegreen.com, which is the nation's largest fundraising platform for climate action. They've made it a priority to help elect pro-climate candidates up and down the ballot.
Yeah, and as a reminder, that Give Green is the organization that Tiernan mentioned as part of the interview, and is a partnership between the League of Conservation Voters and NRDC.
And I think it's important to remember that there are approximately 3 million Americans living internationally at the moment, or 3 million Americans of voting age who are living internationally at the moment. And we know that some of these swing states are going to come down to a few thousand votes. So it's really important, if you know somebody living overseas right now, to reach out to them and say, hey, maybe you should consider voting at this next election. In Australia, there are about 100,000 US people of voting age living here right now. In the last midterm elections, only 3% bothered to get out and vote. So, there's huge untapped potential there. So if you know anybody that is from any of those swing states, please reach out to them and ask them to vote.
And it's really easier than ever nowadays. I mean, I have mine virtually this year from Spain. So definitely no excuse not to get out there, get out the vote, and elect a pro-climate candidate.
For sure. And if you don't know, folks that you can nudge about getting out to vote this election, as Tiernan mentioned, go to the League of Conservation Voters website, and they've definitely got opportunities to help recruit voters, whether door to door, over the phone, or texting. Well, that's all for this episode. Thanks to everybody for coming back and tuning in. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. Don't forget to sign up for that newsletter, and follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.